We are talking about Cardi, but before we get started, we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. We recognize the unique and enduring relationships that exist between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands that we live and work on rest on the traditional lands of Native people who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. So what we're talking about today is Cardi. Many of you have heard of Cardi, some of you have not. And the big issue is that PGE, Portland General Electric, owns the Cardi generating station, also known as the Cardi gas plant. And they are requesting from DEQ a really massive increase in harmful pollution from that Cardi plant. So we're going to be hearing from a couple great panelists today to talk more about what exactly is going on at Cardi, what are they asking for, what are the risks to our health and safety and to the planet, and what can we do about it. So many of you already know that we have 1 week left, roughly. December 17th is the end of the comment period. And throughout the webinar, I'll be putting some links in the chat, including the petition link that if you haven't signed it, please sign it. It's really important that we get as many signatures to DEQ as possible. And then also we're going to ask that you share that with your friends so that we can really make sure people know what's going on and make sure that DEQ knows that we really reject this increase in pollution in a time that we are really critically needing to take aggressive actions to reduce emissions. So I don't want to take up too much time talking because we have some great content. So I'm going to get started. And our first speaker today is Erin Saylor. Erin is a staff attorney with Columbia Riverkeeper, and Erin graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School with a certificate in environmental and natural resources law. Erin's been doing amazing work on stopping fossil fuel pollution and protecting the Columbia River and communities that live on the river. So with that, I will pass it to you, Erin. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kate. Let me see if I can get my slides up smoothly here. Oh, can you guys see the? All right. Okay, so today we're talking about PGE's air permit modification for the Cardi generating station. I just want to give you all a disclaimer before we get too far into this. I am not an engineer. I am an attorney. I have done my very best. I've had a lot of conversations with the expert. We hired Dr. Ron Sahu to help us review this permit. And I've had a lot of really excellent conversations with him about the technical aspects that I'm going to get into today. So I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have, just as long as you recognize that little asterisk that I am not an engineer, so I may not be able to get super in depth. At the outset, just so you all know, I think most of the folks on the webinar today probably understand that the Cardi plant is located next to or is part of the Boardman coal facility. PGE first proposed the idea of constructing a gas-fired power plant to replace the capacity lost by the closure of the Boardman coal-fired power plant as part of its 2009 integrated resource plan. Construction began back in January of 2014, and it was officially opened and put online in July of 2016. So the construction process was not without its drama. In December of 2015, PGE ended up firing the construction firm that it had hired to build the facility. Basically, the company called Abengoa, which is a Spanish-based company, it indicated it was going to file for bankruptcy and started turning away workers from the job site. So PGE jumped in, declared the company in default of its construction agreement and took over control of the construction itself. So the whole debacle resulted in significant cost overruns for PGE that both PGE that they were concerned that the company and ratepayers were going to have to end up shouldering in the end. Luckily for both, in 2018, PGE was able to settle its claims against the company and its insurance companies, and the construction was completed on time, and it came online on time in the summer of 2016. So when PGE first sought an air permit for Cardi back when it started its construction process, it provided DEQ with estimates from the turbine manufacturer, which is Mitsubishi, regarding what the emissions at the plant were expected to be. Now, shortly after it came online, PGE obtained new data from Mitsubishi that showed that the emissions might actually be higher than they originally anticipated. So it's one, oh, let me move on here. Oops, sorry, I should have moved into my slides. So here, this is basically what I just went over. One thing that's kind of important to understand as we're talking about what this permit modification is that Oregon DEQ typically develops permit emissions by calculating what they think the estimated emissions are going to be based on some emissions factors, as well as the facility's production or process rates. So it's meant to calculate actual or projected emissions under normal operating scenarios. So this would be when the plant is fully up and running, warmed up, running continuously. These emissions factors don't really take into account emissions variations that happen during startups or shutdowns, operating load fluctuations, ambient conditions, if it's super cold or super hot out, as well as the quality of the fuel. So if a facility has a continuous emissions monitoring system, or what's referred to as a SEMS, emissions limits can be set using actual emissions data. But typically, again, what Oregon DEQ is just kind of calculates this estimated emissions. So that's what has happened here. So initially, Mitsubishi provided PGE and DEQ with the emissions factors that would be used to calculate these estimated emissions. And so now they've come back and said, hey, those calculations are wrong. You need to use this new calculation. And by doing that, it's going to push our projected emissions higher than what we think that they might be. So in Cardi's current permit, there have been a lot of questions. Well, they're asking for such a dramatic increase. How are they not out of compliance with their current permit right now? In Cardi's case, like we just said, they're calculated, not based on what their actual emissions are, but all of these projected paperwork exercise here. PGE, now that they're saying that it's incorrect, we went back and we asked DEQ. Let me skip ahead here. Here we go. So we went and we asked DEQ, are they out of compliance? Basically, technically, no, because the emissions factors that they're using to calculate their emissions are part of their permit. And so even though they know that they're wrong, legally, they have to use the ones that are in their permit. So if Cardi were to use the new emissions factors that Mitsubishi came forward with and apply them to the emissions limits that are in the current permit, they likely would be out of compliance. So we'll come back to this in a second because this is all super technical. So you can see what this means in terms of their actual emissions, or what they project their actual emissions to be. This table came out of the public notice. The current permit limit tons per year right here. This includes all of the emissions from the Boardman coal-fired plant, which is now offline. So you have to subtract them all out. I did the math over here in this column. So their current permit limit specific to Cardi is 99 tons per year of carbon monoxide, which they're asking now for 294 tons per year, which is an increase of 195 tons per year of carbon monoxide. With respect to VOCs, their current limit is 24 tons per year, and they're seeking to have a new permit limit of 195 tons per year. So that is also a very significant increase that this change in how they calculate their emissions has created. So one thing that's important to keep in mind, that's another really kind of confusing aspect about how to understand all this, is that the emissions limits in the permit show the maximum amount that Cardi can emit based on these projected emissions calculations. So PGE is maintaining, and DEQ is also claiming, although we question how much of the data they've looked at themselves, that the actual emissions of Cardi are actually much lower than the limits in their permit. This is really hard to prove, however, because PGE currently is only testing for CO emissions. So I mentioned that continuous emissions monitoring system, or SEMS, earlier. They have a SEMS for CO emissions. So that means they are continuously monitoring the CO emissions that come out of their stack. But that's it. They are not testing for VOCs right now. What they're doing instead is another paperwork calculation exercise where they're trying to create this correlation between what the carbon monoxide emissions are and what their VOC emissions are. So they're basically saying, well, you're emitting X number of CO emissions, so we're going to do some calculations, and that probably means that you're emitting Y amount of VOC emissions. Our expert has looked at this. DEQ has basically admitted their own write-up in the permit review report, as well as a separate conversation that we had with them recently, admitted that there really isn't a strong correlation between CO emissions and VOC emissions. So in a lot of respects, DEQ and PGE are flying blind with respect to what the actual VOC emissions are at Cardi right now. So this last point here, even though the emissions limits show kind of a maximum amount of what they might emit, which is the limit that they're asking for, you know, the question that I ask is, well, why do you have to give them this huge high limit if they're not actually anywhere close to it right now, allegedly? One of the reasons why PGE and for some reason DEQ want to put this into the permit is just to account for any kinds of emission spikes or uncertainty that might occur during startup events. So we already covered this. Before I get into this, one thing I want to point out that's kind of fundamentally important to understand too is that with these power plants, so what happens is during a startup event, the facility, there's two different kinds of startups. There's what's called a cold startup, where everything's been shut down for quite a long while, all the equipment's cold. And there's warm startups where maybe it hasn't been shut down as long, so the equipment's a little bit warmer. Why this is important is because, like a car, these emissions systems or the controls that they have on the stack take a while to warm up. So during a startup event, especially a cold start, you're going to see much higher emissions of COs and VOC than you would see when the plant is fully up and running, fully warmed up. So that's why they want to keep the permit limit higher, because there's a lot of uncertainty about how many startups they're going to have over the course of the year. Right now, DEQ is estimating that they're doing about one per week. DEQ was, pointed out to us that there are a lot of plants that do multiple startups a day. There are other plants that only do it a couple times a year. So Cardi's sort of in the middle with respect to that, but we definitely want to see fewer startups in terms of CO and VOC emissions. So what we're seeing so far, based on reviewing the permit review report, as well as our conversations with DEQ, is that they seem to be pretty deferential to PGE's requests here. I mean, it looks like basically PGE came out and said, hey, Mitsubishi said we need to change our emissions factors. It's going to lead to this increase in projected emissions. And DEQ basically said, okay, here's the draft permit. But what we really want to do during this comment period is push back on DEQ and really encourage them to take advantage of these options that they have. So one is that, they can require PGE to turn over more actual carbon monoxide CO emissions. data. So, our understanding right now is basically DEQ has just been reviewing annual kind of average emissions for CO. And it is an annual limit that they have in their permit. However, because PGE has a SEMS for CO emissions data, they have hour by hour, minute by minute emissions information. And so they have a ton of emissions information data at their fingertips that could really help DEQ and the public understand what the emissions are during these startup events. The other thing that we would love to see DEQ implement here is to require a SEM system for VOCs. Like I mentioned before, there is no correlation between carbon monoxide and VOC emissions. So we'd really love to see them actually test for VOCs so that they have some sort of sense of what the actual VOC emissions are. And then the last big one, there's lots of other little things that we plan to comment on, but the last big one is to lower what's known as the best available control technology or back limit for VOCs in the permit. So I think I'm planning to go through each of these in turn. So we basically covered this already. This just talks about how they're experiencing about one startup a week and how it's really important to have a full understanding of what the CO emissions are kind of across the board of different operating scenarios. VOC emissions. So this little image that I put on here is a picture, kind of they're all the systems are different, but this is just an example of what a SEM system would do. This is the emission stack here. And you can see that they have different monitors and probes so that they can really assess what the emissions are coming out the stack. There's no regulatory requirement that DEQ can rely on to force PGE to test its actual emissions. But since DEQ has acknowledged that there's no clear correlation between CO and VOC emissions, they seem well within their rights to ask for this information. PGE has claimed that these sorts of systems for VOCs are not reliable and they're hard to operate, but these systems are available and are used by other industries. There's also the potential that if it's a cost concern, if PGE doesn't want to pay to put the system on and then have it turn out to be super unreliable, there is the option that they could potentially lease a system for a few months, see how it goes. That would at least allow them to get some testing data so we have some sense of what their VOC emissions are. DEQ, when we talked to them last week, they also suggested that they might be going out soon to do some sort of stack testing. It would just be a snapshot in time, not this continuous emissions monitoring that a SEMS would do, but just to try to confirm whether or not there is this correlation between the CO and the VOC emissions. Now, best available control technology or BACT. This basically requires implementation of the best emission control technology that's technologically available and economically feasible. So what DEQ does to set this limit is they look at all the different similar plants across the country, look at what emissions control technology those facilities are implementing, and then what emissions limits they are able to get down to using that technology, how much it costs, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular, with the VOC back limit that DEQ set in their permit right now, in their discussion in the permit review report, they discussed this other facility called the new covert generating facility that's very, very, very similar to Cardi, but has a lower back limit of 1 parts per million by volume. So we questioned DEQ, well, if this other facility is so similar to Cardi, why can't Cardi also meet that same lower limit of 1? Right now, the draft permit has the back limit for VOC set at 2. DEQ basically acknowledged to us that they should take a harder look at that. So we're hopeful that DEQ is going to go back and look at that again. And, if it really isn't possible for Cardi to implement the same technologies that this new covert generating facility has implemented to lower its VOC back limit, DEQ needs to provide a much better explanation for why those same emissions controls can't be implemented at Cardi. One interesting thing about BACT 2 that's really hard for my non-engineering brain to understand is that when you have a lower BACT limit, so you would expect to see lower emissions when the facility is up and fully operating again, when it's fully warmed up. But it wouldn't necessarily mean lower emissions during startup events. And again, it comes down to the fact that that technology wouldn't be fully warmed up yet. So even if they lower the BACT limit in the permit from 2 to 1, that might not necessarily correlate to a lower permit or plant site emissions limit overall. Okay, I'm sure we will see this again at the end after Melanie's had a chance to speak. But just a reminder, comments are due Friday, December 17th. There's a couple different ways that you can participate. One is through Columbia Riverkeeper's website. We have a petition there that you can sign, but you're also welcome to submit your own comments to the permit coordinator at DEQ, whose information is on here. So I am screen sharing, so I can't see the comments. Are there any questions that anyone has? I just gave a lot of information that's very, very detailed.
Thank you so much, Erin. And yes, I think there will be a number of questions. And so what I think might work best is for folks to, yeah, Mark, we're recording the presentation. So anyone who wants to watch it again will be sent an email after the webinar that will have the link to the recording. And of course, we're available for questions, but we're going to have a Q&A at the end where we can put questions in the chat. I still have questions. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's just dumbfounded that, you know, it's not a requirement from Department of Environmental Quality to actually measure what emissions are going to the air. And it seems to be fairly standard practice to allow industry to self-report these calculated, you know, emissions without actually ever measuring the air near the facility. So especially with these VOCs, I think it's pretty outrageous that not only do they not know what the actual emissions are now, they know for sure they're using an erroneous, a bad calculation essentially. And it sounds like to me that PGE, it's really like they have some choice in the matter. They could decide we're going to invest in this available technology in order to take the most protective steps to be in line with our goals for moving towards clean energy that we're getting so much positive attention about, right? But really they're simultaneously, while they're getting this positive attention about this transition to clean fuels or reducing emissions at least, they're simultaneously asking for an increase in harmful pollution in an area that is already overburdened, an area that they don't actually service, and they won't be measuring those emissions if they were to get that permit modification. So it sounds like PGE has a lot of ownership here too, and DEQ hopefully will step up and do its job and protect our communities from breathing, you know, being subjected to exposures from filthy air. But PGE has a lot of ownership here too, I think, in terms of utilizing their large pool of resources to take protective action. I see Diane's asking if it's a Title V, and actually, Diane, we should clarify there is a Title V permit for the Cardi facility, and it's shared with the old Boardman facility. So it's a little confusing. And Erin, you might have something more to say on that Title V.
Yeah, so that process is actually going to be starting soon too, that they need to revise their Title V permit. What this permit is basically it discusses how the plant is constructed. And so it was their construction air permit that they had initially. And so even though it's already fully constructed and operational, the technologies that they're using and the limits that they have in place based on those technologies would be captured in this, what's called an ACDP, air contaminant discharge permit. But they also have a Title V permit that handles their operations. So that'll be coming up soon for public comment as well.
Thanks, Erin. I just have one more clarification before we get to hearing what Melanie has to say. But if PGE wanted, could they use the updated calculation that's more accurate if they chose to? Are they actually required by law to use the outdated calculation, or is it just that DEQ can't require it until the permit is modified? Could PGE say, hey, for the sake of public health, we're going to opt in to using this more accurate calculation? It's the least we could do, right? Is that an option for them? Do you know?
I don't know exactly. And, you know, where I get all confused is that this is all really a paperwork exercise here, you know, with these calculations. So, you know, how they calculate it doesn't necessarily correlate to what's coming out of the stack. So I think that's something else to keep in mind here too, is that even though the permit is going to be, you know, potentially allowing additional emissions, the way Cardi's currently operating is not going to change. So really, this is, in a way, it's kind of backpedaling in a way. You know, if we can get DEQ to require PGE to put on more emissions controls, or to put on, you know, better testing methods, that sort of thing, it's really going to be, hopefully we can just get some improvements to the way they're operating right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. We'll revisit some of this in the Q&A, I think so. But I do want to get to Melanie. Thank you so much, Erin. That's very helpful explanation of stuff. Next, we're going to hear from Melanie Plout. And Melanie is a retired OBGYN physician and a member of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Melanie volunteers with a number of organizations working on the climate crisis and has been very involved in a number of campaigns. And Melanie is going to talk to us today about a lot of the health impacts from some of the Cardi emissions and fracking in general. So thanks so much, Melanie, for being here. I'll pass to you.
Great. I assume you see my slides fine.
Yep, looks great.
Great. So I'm going to talk today about, I'm going to get a little philosophical about how the connection between climate change and air pollution, and why we need to fight against air pollution to make an effect on climate change. So there are really three ways that the burning of fossil fuels affects our health. First of all, by greenhouse gases, all of you know about that, which can cause extreme weather, food shortages, and then the extraction of the fossil fuels. You think about fracking, polluting the water and the air. And then the third, which we're going to talk about mostly today, is that the direct burning of the fossil fuels causes air pollution in the area where they are burned. So I recently read this article, and I recommend it. It's by David Wallace Wells, published in the London Review of Books, and it struck me pretty deeply. He basically says that there are more deaths from air pollution globally than from COVID, influenza, or from war, murder, and terrorism combined. He quotes one person in the article saying that if you see one person run over in the street, you'll never forget it. But thousands dying from air pollution will never even faze you. Another point in the article, this environmental historian, Stephen Pine, says that we should be calling this era not the Anthropocene, but the Pyrocene, because basically what we've done is we've burned everything. And everything that we burn, we breathe. I'm sure you've all seen lists like this, and you can look at this and think about what health condition you are most concerned about or worried about for your family members. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, premature birth, autism, depression and suicide, heart disease, cancer, asthma, and strokes, all well associated with air pollution of some kind. This quote is funny. Stock market returns are lower on days with higher air pollution. Surgical outcomes are worse. Crime goes up with increased particulate concentrations, especially violent crime. When there's more smog in the air, chess players make more mistakes and bigger ones. Politicians speak more simplistically, and baseball umpires make more bad calls. So to turn this around, everything is better when the air is cleaner. Rules that lead to cleaner air will also help with climate change, because if we're not burning the fossil fuels, we're not putting the CO2 into the atmosphere. A side benefit of emphasizing air pollution is that there is more political support for cleaning the air than there is for affecting climate change. But that's an interesting point. So let's get to the Cardi modification. PGE says that the original estimates were in error. They want to increase the permitted volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, by 800%, and the permitted carbon monoxide, but by 300%. I'm going to talk about these pollutants individually. So VOCs, volatile, means that they evaporate, they are gases, and they are organic, they contain carbon. I clarified for myself that the EPA classifies and regulates indoor and outdoor VOCs separately. So indoor VOCs, it's like when you go into the hardware store and you want a low VOC paint, for instance. Whereas the outdoor VOCs are these reactive organic gases, and there are thousands of them. Basically, these are compounds which react to form ozone, and those are the VOCs that the EPA regulates for outdoor use. So why are these VOCs a problem? Well, basically, along with another result of burning fossil fuels, the nitrogen oxides, when you add the VOCs and the NOxes together in the face of heat and sunlight, you get ozone. So what's the deal with ozone? So good ozone, because you remember that we were in trouble, right? Because there was an ozone hole and it wasn't protecting us from the UV radiation. Well, good ozone is up in the stratosphere. But when you get this ground level ozone, which is 3 oxygen atoms hooked together, that is where you get into problems. This is a helpful graphic from the Washington Environmental Council that shows the green thumb for the high level ozone and the red downward thumb for ground level ozone. So some people use the term interchangeably, ground level ozone and smog, although I guess technically, and maybe Erin can elaborate on this, smog is really ozone and other pollutants like particulate matter. So ozone's a problem because it irritates sensitive tissues like in our eyes and in our lungs. It's been likened to a sunburn for your lungs. So in the short term, this can cause coughing, wheezing, eye irritation, and ER visits for people who have lung disease. In the long term, it's been shown to cause an increased risk of asthma in kids and problems for babies. It increases low birth weight babies and decreased lung function after birth, as well shown by a study from 2005. And then I thought this was quite interesting, the mortality. They looked at Medicare population, so I'm a member now, and there was a linear relationship with ozone levels. So the more ozone in your neighborhood, the higher your premature mortality was. And this went down to very low levels, suggesting that essentially there's no safe level of ozone. So I'm going to move on to carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide, is released when anything is burned. The biggest danger is if you have carbon monoxide indoors. That's why we have our monitors in our homes, many of us. What does it do? Well, carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Normally, your red blood cells carry oxygen from your lungs to all the organs in your body, but the carbon monoxide takes the place, basically, of the oxygen by binding very tightly to the hemoglobin so that the oxygen can no longer be moved in that way. So as you can imagine, the carbon monoxide risks outdoors are primarily to people who have some kind of borderline health condition, which means that they're not getting enough oxygen already to their tissues. So this would be people who have heart problems, and carbon monoxide can increase their likelihood of having chest pain or angina, especially if they're exerting themselves outdoors. And it can also adversely affect unborn infants and people with anemia. Carbon monoxide also interacts with other pollutants to form ozone, and it's a weak greenhouse gas. So I'm going to move on a little bit from these direct pollutants that we're talking about in this modification at Cardi to a more general discussion of the harms of fracking, because the gas that is being burned at Cardi, the majority of it will come from fracking. So fracking, of course, causes lots of water contamination, uses massive quantities of water. And in fact, about a third of the locations where fracking occurs are parts of the country that are already undergoing water stress. The chemicals used in fracking are considered proprietary, so we may not know what they are. And in addition to these chemicals, many of which are known carcinogens or endocrine disruptors, fracking brings to the surface naturally occurring toxic substances. So you have this toxic mix, a combination of the chemicals and the substances that have been brought to the surface, and contamination of water can occur from all of this awful soup, either in underground aquifers or on the surface from spills, leaks, intentional releases, or holding ponds. Here's some of the chemicals that are known. There are thousands of chemicals that are used in fracking, and we don't have data for many of them on the effects of human exposure, but some of these you've probably heard of: benzene, leukemia; toluene, birth defects; xylene, nausea, vomiting, neurological effects; naphthalene, coma, confusion, convulsions; formaldehyde, lung and throat cancer. And then these are some of the toxics that are brought to the surface by fracking: arsenic, strontium, radium, and radon, and iron and magnesium, which, as you can see, also cause their health problems. So the people who live close to fracking wells are at risk for worse health outcomes in general. Sometimes we don't always know why the fracking causes these health risks. It could be the water contamination, as we've talked about, but it could also be the air or the soil, or maybe it's the truck traffic from the diesel vehicles that are used in large numbers. So here's just one interesting article from Pennsylvania. This was really smartly done, I think. They looked between 2004 and 2013, when fracking was really getting established in Pennsylvania. And they looked at siblings who were born before and after fracking. So that controlled for, the maternal effects. And what they found is that if the mother lived within a kilometer of a well, there was a 25% increase in the probability of the baby being born low birth weight. But effects were also seen up to 3 kilometers from the wells. And there were other effects too, besides low birth weight, but that was the most dramatic one. So in tallying all the health risks from Cardi, there's the direct local air pollution, with the biggest burden being on the vulnerable communities that are in the vicinity of Boardman, but also to all of us because of the airstream that comes down the gorge. There's the contribution to greenhouse gases and global warming. And then there's effects on the health of the people who live where the methane is being fracked in often vulnerable communities in other states. Huge justice issues here. So we're going to tell you to ask DEQ, please take a deep breath, realize that we don't want an increase in these pollutants, and it would be quite lovely if we stopped burning so much frack gas. And I'm going to toss it back to Kate.
Wow, thank you so much, Melanie. That is very informative and disturbing. Really, when you think about the context, the implications of this pollution that's not really closely being monitored. Well, it's not being measured at all. This is all just taking industry at its word. And this frac gas pollution and exposure risks is very relevant. DEQ has said that they don't know how much frac gas is going into this facility. All of those harmful chemicals that were in that list, people all along from extraction to transport to combustion are exposed to those dangerous chemicals. And it's another industry that's highly unregulated, right? We asked DEQ, are you looking at emissions from frac gas? And the answer was no, because they assume those emissions are accounted for elsewhere, and they just aren't. And the decisions that we make here in Oregon really have very serious effects on the health and safety of communities upstream and downstream, as well as our own surrounding communities. So it's really important that not only we spread awareness of this, but we hold both industry and our state agencies accountable for doing their job and for taking more protective measures, not just taking advantage of what they can get away with, because these industry has just like unlimited resources, it feels like, and to not be taking available measures that are protective of the community and the environment, it feels pretty outrageous. So this just highlights, it seems like, you said at one point, it seems there's no level of exposure that's safe. And so for folks who live in these areas, these exposures are chronic. And there's, as I understand it, a real limitation to what people can do to protect themselves from these threats. So that just really amplifies the importance of us communicating to DEQ how strongly we feel about this, right? Because there aren't really available options for folks in those areas to get protection unless we can motivate our state agencies to do it. So thank you for explaining all that, Melanie. And I'm sure folks have questions. So I mean, I know I'm still thinking about a lot of this, and I've been working on this for a while. So I know it's understandable if folks are feeling a little overwhelmed or confused. It is confusing. We've been trying to sort it out for months, and it's confusing. So sometimes I feel like that it's by design. So we are doing our best to try and make this digestible for folks so they can be as outraged as we are that they're essentially considering allowing increasing exposures to communities. Like this to me sounds like an issue between PGE and the manufacturer, right? It doesn't sound like a burden that already vulnerable communities should have to bear when they've been told that even when Cardi was built, here's what you're going to be exposed to. And now it's kind of a bait and switch, like, well, actually, we did the math wrong. And here's what you probably have been exposed to all along. So it's really important that we step up and make our voices heard. And we've done it before. In 2018, they wanted a very similar increase in pollution, and people stood up and said no. And PGE has some ownership in this as well about doing the right thing. So thank you, Melanie and Aaron. I want to open it up for folks to put their questions into the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. And then we will try to get back to you if we can't get to all of them. And I saw one from a little bit earlier that I wanted to start with, come back to, from John. John says, it was mentioned briefly, but how is Cardi within compliance of their current permit? Is that because the permit is still within the larger Boardman permit? And I think this has to do more with them being allowed to use a bad calculation. Maybe Aaron, you could clarify that.
Yeah, so that's what's happening is they're under the terms of the permit, they are supposed to use this older, which they now are saying is outdated and incorrect calculation to estimate what their emissions are. So DEQ has seen the carbon monoxide data. So my understanding is that I probably believe DEQ that they're in compliance with the CO limits, but the VOCs, and this gets to Mark's question a little bit later on, they don't know what the VOC emissions are because they're doing it purely this guesswork by doing this calculation between, well, we know what your carbon monoxide emissions are, so we're going to do this math equation and we're going to guess that that means your VOCs are X amount, but they don't know for sure because they're not testing. So yes, Cardi is in compliance with their current permit just because of the way those calculations are being estimated, or their emissions are being estimated.
Thank you, Erin. And one thing that PGE does know, and that DEQ knows, and that we all know, is that they're using a bad calculation and that their actual emissions are likely much higher than their reporting. So that's a big issue. Okay, I saw a question about the demographics, and yes, this is something else I wanted to address. This is a really serious environmental justice issue, and that's a big part of why we're very concerned. In Morrow County, where the facility is located, the population is over 40% Latinx. In neighboring Umatilla County, it's over 25% Latinx. And there are, there's been a lot of opposition to this increase in the past from folks in the area, tribal folks, community groups, environmental groups. There's just been a lot of widespread opposition. So it's really a problem that PGE is requesting this harmful increase in emissions in an area that's already overburdened, has already frontline communities who are already vulnerable to increased exposures, and it's a real issue. And as I said before, it's an area that they don't serve, so it's not a service area that PGE covers. So they're choosing an area to pollute, and we are trying to make sure that those communities aren't subjected to more of this, and that the pollution that they already are being subjected to is actually accounted for. Okay, let's see. I have a question from Emily. I'm thinking about how the startups at the plant are supposedly leading to the highest levels of emissions. To keep the emissions lower, is there any danger that Cardi's solution would simply be to run the plant more continuously? And Erin, that might be another question for you. And in fact, like, would that be better? Like, since they're, it's supposed to be run more as that kind of base loading versus the operating kind of like a peaker plant.
Yeah, I think in terms of whether they can just do that on their own, I think the answer to that is no, because they have told DEQ and also the Energy Facility Siting Council how many hours per year or whatever it is that they anticipate running. So I think if to make the decision to be a baseload plant instead of a peaker plant, I think that would require some additional levels of review. They couldn't just do that on their own. In terms of whether the emissions would end up being lower, potentially in terms of the carbon monoxide and the VOCs, again, it would depend on, total hours of operation and all of that. But as I touched on a little bit earlier, the CO and VOC emissions tend to be a lot higher during startups because the emissions equipment isn't working properly yet. But when they're full operation, some of the other pollutants may end up going higher. So NOx and SOx and that sort of thing. So they might end up reducing CO and VOC emissions, but increasing other pollutants.
Thanks, Erin. And actually, that's just making me wonder and you might know the answer to this, but I'm just wondering if DEQ has the option of, PGE kind of wrote this request for the increase, and DEQ's job is to say yes or no, but does DEQ have the option to just do a modification to the permit that says you just have to update the calculation and not approve an increase in emissions, so that in fact maybe Cardi might have to alter their operations to be within their actual emissions limits in the permit in the first place? Or is that something that DEQ has the regulatory authority to do?
I think it's all tied together with what the best available control technology decision was backed. So DEQ is basically making two determinations. One, what is the emissions factor? And then two, what equipment do you have to put on to meet the lowest emissions that you can? And so I think it would all be tied together. So one of the things that we're asking for specifically with respect to VOCs is, hey, it looks like there is additional technology available that other plants have used and have shown that it's affordable and it does reduce emissions. So DEQ absolutely has the responsibility to say, PGE, you need to put this equipment on, or you need to tell us why you can't do it. So there's definitely more that DEQ can do here to strengthen the permit.
Thanks, Erin. I have a question for Melanie. It says, if carbon monoxide affects affects oxygen absorption and ozone is like a sunburn for your lungs, are folks with respiratory conditions like asthma at more risk?
Absolutely. People with asthma, people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, people with heart disease, those are people who are all at more risk from both of these pollutants. Absolutely.
Sounds like a real double whammy for folks with respiratory conditions, on top of everything else that we have in our air. Thanks, Melanie. I see a question from Theodora. How does air pollution work into the governor's executive order on climate change and efforts of state agencies to protect most impacted underserved communities? That's a great question, Theodora, because this is a big issue. We've done a lot of really hard work in Oregon to set very ambitious goals for reducing emissions. We passed HB 2021 this year. And you know, the climate protection program is exempting these power plants. So it's really a reason that DEQ should be doubling down on aggressive reduction of emissions at these plants that are exempt versus green lighting more pollution. But I don't know if Melanie or Erin, if you have any comment on the governor's executive order on climate change.
I'm going to look into that. Thank you, Theodora.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's worth looking into. My first, the first thing that comes to mind is I think that the executive's order was mostly focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And I know that state agencies, including DEQ, were specifically directed to do everything in their power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The issue here is that the emissions that we're dealing with are primarily carbon monoxide and VOCs, and the greenhouse gas emissions are not changing. But it's definitely worth, you know, this is again where my engineering and chemistry failings come into play here, but it's definitely worth looking into whether, you know, that increase in CO and VOCs would also lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that DEQ is maybe not picking up here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes the way they try to handle some of their emissions do result in secondary pollution. So that's a great point. I see a question from Frank saying, does Mitsubishi have financial exposure in this? And that's a great question, because when I was listening to this, I was thinking, wow, this sounds like if they get this permit modification approved, it sounds like a real incentive for manufacturers to collude with industry and miscalculate until things are permitted. So what, is there any accountability for the manufacturer? Or are they just kind of whoopsie daisy? Because you know, this whole thing seems wild. I can't take my car into the DEQ after mismanaging my maintenance and say, hey, take it up with Subaru, right? Like, it's up to me to make sure that I'm meeting the requirements. So is there any ownership on Mitsubishi's end for that?
I don't know the answer to that. You know, this is pure speculation, but, you know, potentially if PGE is forced to implement some other control technologies that they didn't think they were going to have to do, you know, potentially they could turn around and try to get Mitsubishi to have to pay for them, but that's pure speculation. I do not know how that would work.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, again, I feel like this is part of the problem that we deal with, is that when we try to find where the accountability lies, it's like, oh, maybe it's over there. And then you talk over there and they're like, no, I think it's over there. So there's, you know, a real kind of dodging of responsibility. And that's why I think having community members who are affected coming forward and speaking up about it. It's so important. And it really does make a difference. It doesn't always feel like it when you go sign another petition, right? But these petition signatures add up. And I can tell folks that we've already got thousands of people who have signed comments in opposition in this very short comment period. So I hope that gives people hope that, you know, even though with everything else that's going on in people's lives, people are taking time to care about this, and it's gonna matter because we now, with each person that signed, now that makes thousands of people. So it's really inspiring to me that people are taking time. You know, it's hard to get people excited about a permit modification, right? We have all of these really serious things we're all trying to navigate. And so really appreciate everyone for showing up today as well. Let me just check. I think there was another question that we have maybe time for. So there was one question about deciding the limit on the best available control technology. And so the question is, how does DEQ decide that parts per million by volume for the permit? And is there just that one? You mentioned there was one other plant who had a lower limit, and is that something they can use as a comparison for DEQ to say, like, this is possible, it's being done, now you need to do it, kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we're hoping for here, because that other facility is so similar to Cardi that it's really hard for DEQ to argue that that technology that they're using at that facility is not achievable for Cardi. You know, with a lot of these back determinations, what the agency will do is say, you know, plant A has this technology and plant B has this technology, but there's all these differences between that plant and the one we're trying to permit, and that's why it doesn't work here. And they just can't really do that with the new covert generating facility that they mentioned in the permit review report, because they're so similar. So that's definitely something that we're hoping to push DEQ to take a harder look at.
Thanks, Erin. And for folks who are watching, Mark is putting some very some good resources in the chat. And Mark has a question about the metals like mercury. Metals like mercury and arsenic are absorbed in the lungs, and phospholipids of the brain, once they're absorbed, they are there forever. So polonium-210 found in cigarettes is an alpha emitter and a known cause of lung cancer. Any irradiated heavy metal is dangerous once it gets into the body. I wonder how much mercury is being emitted at Cardi. So do I, Mark. I wonder if DEQ wonders.
Right.
And I don't think we do know that, because that a lot of the those emissions too are associated with the frack gas, which is not regulated by DEQ. I don't know if there's any monitoring equipment, Erin, that would capture a read on metals like mercury.
I think we would need Dr. Sahu here to answer that one.
Yeah, I think that's true. But it's a great thing to think about. And I just have one more. I'm gonna give just one more quick question. And somebody, Melanie, wanted to just ask about the connection between this VOC pollution that is a contributor to low-level ozone and the heat events like the heat dome we saw this summer, and how that contribute, like how those two are connected.
Yeah, I can't speak directly to the chemistry, but it makes sense to me that the more sun, the more heat we have, that there would be more of this process where the VOCs are converted into the low-level ozone. And again, depending on the weather, there may be sort of stagnation of the air that could make that worse. So yeah, these things are all connected, definitely all connected. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so I think so too. There's these the gorge can get these inversion events, right, where the air just kind of like stays put at a low level. And as you mentioned, sunlight is a key ingredient for low-level ozone. So it does make sense that if we have more heat and sunlight available, and then we add and make make another key ingredient more available with these huge belches of VOCs into the air shed, then it's likely that we're going to potentially see an increase in that low-level ozone forming, which has a lot of negative effects. So we are right at 1 o'clock. I know we could just keep going and going, and I want to just encourage folks. We have 1 week left. I've just put the petition link and the comment guide in the chat again. Please, if you haven't already signed the petition, sign the petition. If you have signed the petition, it would be amazing if you could share it with your networks of fellow concerned friends and family and colleagues who might be interested in learning more about this. We're going to have a recording available. It will be on Facebook right after this, but then we'll also send out a link to the recording. If anyone has any questions that didn't get answered and want some follow-up, feel free to reach out to myself or to Erin. And if you have a question for Melanie, we can get in touch with her as well. And again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to care about this issue, to make sure that you are doing what you can to protect our communities and our planet. It really does matter. We really have an effect on other people's health. So thank you all so much. And yeah, go share the petition, and we're gonna get DEQ to reject this crazy increase request. So thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.